While I try to manage to open up the PowerPoint presentation, first of all, let me express my deepest gratitude for the kind invitation. And to all the organizers and of course to the BSH for hosting this event here. So now I would like to touch upon the issue of trying to embed spatial analyses with a more in-depth cultural historical discussion. And in order to do so, because as I'm aware, there might be some people in the audience who are not too familiar with spatial analyses and landscape archaeology, I wanted to start with very briefly introducing the terms spatial analysis and landscape archaeology, very briefly, very generally as I understand them, but then very quickly to proceed with two specific case studies. The first one being that of the hinterland of Petra in modern-day Jordan, and the second one dealing with territorial questions concerning the ironage polities on ancient Cyprus, specifically that of Idalion, and then to end with some concluding thoughts about how to embed spatial analyses within a larger cultural historical discourse. So to very quickly talk about spatial analysis and landscape archaeology, at least my personal definition of those, I share the conviction of these authors here shown on the slide and hopefully also online, that landscape archaeology is the interdisciplinary field that tries to link numerous disciplines from the humanities and the natural sciences, but most importantly that people lie at the core of landscape archaeology, which can be described as a reasonable umbrella term that researches all kinds of research dealing with the social construction of space. Personally, specifically, I follow the definition of Petra, who defines landscape archaeology as the study of the genesis of cultural landscapes, so meaning the human-induced changes on the various components of landscape, and that landscape archaeology is practiced by all those who deal with questions that gain insights into that specific genesis of cultural landscapes. So for me, landscape archaeology is an approach that applies specific spatial analytical methods, so it is not a discipline. So that being said, we'll leave it at that because we very quickly have to proceed with the first case study, being that of the Petrian hinterland in modern-day Jordan, just to give you a very brief introduction into the history of Petra and the Nabateans. Petra is located in modern-day southern Jordan, Petra being the capital of the former Nabatean realm, the Nabateans being a former semi-nomadic tribe that settled in and around Petra around or in the course of the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, although the first mentionings of the Nabatoi already reached back to the early Hellenistic period. For some reasons, the Nabateans maintained some sort of independence despite the Roman reorganization, Roman restructuring of the Neos, mostly through Pompeius Mactus in the course of the 1st century BC, but then eventually were acquired into the Provincia Arabia during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. Petra itself is located in this remote desert-like semi-arid environment. The city itself is located in the central plateau as, maybe I can, won't touch it. Well, here in the central plateau, I hope you can see it. Although it is surrounded by steep mountain ranges, starting up here at 1,600 meters above sea level, but ending in the west in the Wadi Araba in the full desert around zero. Just to give you some additional impressions of this very remote desert-like landscape with this rugged, very rough and inhospitable terrain of Petra and its hinterland. Petra, of course, being most famously known for its monumental tomb facades, featuring Greco-Roman as well as Near Eastern luxury architectural designs. These tomb facades were not actually just tomb facades, but part of more monumental tomb complexes, which mirror and reflect the overall monumentality of the city as it has developed throughout the course of the 1st century BC and AD. And this monumentalization of the city, of the urban core of Petra, was only possible, arguably, through the maintenance and control of the rules surrounding the city. And this is where the hinterland comes into play, which can, of course, as an artificial construct, as always, but more or less based on historical records, can be roughly defined as a 20-kilometer radius around the city. And based on archaeological evidence derived by previous survey work and also some limited work conducted by myself, both intensively and extensively, it was possible to research and investigate different aspects of this landscape, which of course I do not have time to go into full detail, obviously, today. Methodologically, the application of specific spatial analytical methods relevant to the research questions were applied, which included also, as we have seen in many other presentations already today, cost service analyses, which included the calculation of least cost paths in specific areas of the Petrine hinterland, or the GIS-based calculation of site catchments that visualize possibly different territories of different social groups dispersed throughout the Petrine hinterland. Also, mostly, or very importantly, when investigating aspects of the military disposition, visibility analyses, of course, as well as larger point pattern analyses, which on the one hand can be distance-based or density-based approaches, as you can see here. For example, the kernel density estimations, as we, I think, also seen in the paper already today. And here, very generally, the question of scale becomes very important. I think this is the subject that many other papers have already talked about. So it makes a huge difference if you're dealing on the macro, meso, or even micro scale. So delving in, zooming into the archaeological details as we were able to do. For example, very recently, just last year, with the first launch of the Petra Hinterland Social Landscapes project, where we were able to conduct very detailed architectural studies of a specific site in the hinterland. And also just to venture out very, very briefly into Greece, and just to show that the German Archaeological Institute also deals with these kinds of issues, specifically within the context of the Kefesos Valley project, which is directed by first director Petra and Petros Niklas. So these are very important issues that dictate the application of the various methods that we apply for research investigations, obviously. But coming back to the desert, the clock is ticking from 12th century BC throughout to late antiquity. And here with this settlement distribution maps, it's important to always correlate it to larger cultural historical developments. For example, here, the stark decrease of sites in the 5th century BC, correlating to the collapse of the Edomite kingdom, but then the huge boom of rural settlements throughout the 1st century BC and AD, which more or less correlates to the so-called sedentarization process of the Nabateans in that period. But we'll leave it at there, because another aspect that I wanted to talk about today, pertaining to the Petrine hinterland, is the aspect of communication infrastructure, communication networks. And here I want to highlight the importance of always ground truthing, if at all possible, all the results that the computer is suggesting to you. And here roads and routes become very important. This is one map showing the differently evidenced roads and routes throughout the Petrine hinterland, which obviously, specifically in this landscape, but in basically every landscape, the impact of the natural landscape becomes very important. And I've already talked about the significance of topography here, and I want to highlight this slope map here. And if you can see this brownish area, right here, this correlates to so-called very severe slopes. So slope areas having 45% and more. But it's not only topography, it's also geology. And this is why if we bring in the geological map, you will see this purplish area that corresponds perfectly with this very severe slopes. And this purplish area on the geological map is volcanic stone. And this is a very important insight gained into the environment of this region, because volcanic stone still is, for the Bedouins, which refer to it as the asondra, the dark stone, very important because it immediately impacts the modes and means of how one can travel and traverse throughout this landscape, as obviously the image on the lower right suggests. The volcanic stone is very important because it dictates the use of different beasts of burden. Most specifically, volcanic stone breaks very sharply, so it cuts the sharp feet of the camels, which are the ships of the desert, as one says, since their domestication. So by evaluating the natural landscape and walking them and ground truthing them, and also conducting analyses, spatial analyses, it is possible to classify and then take that as a basis for further cultural historical discussions in terms of economic trade routes, networks, socio-political networks, etc., etc. But now, since we have a second case study, we have to leave Petra in the desert and go to Cyprus, to specifically Iron Age Cyprus, and everybody dealing with Iron Age Cyprus knows this, of course. So I'm preaching to the choir that immediately, historically, it becomes very difficult when counting the different Iron Age polities, at least. So very early on, with the first historical mentionings, you have a different number, starting with 7, then up to 10. So this is what Maria Iacobu calls the historical elusiveness of these Iron Age polities. And if you want to consider the development or are interested in territorial, further spatial questions concerning these Iron Age polities, the fluctuation of these different Cypriot polities becomes very apparent, very difficult to tackle, to consider, but also to map. And since we're dealing with mapping issues here in spatial analysis in this context, I brought one map presented by David Rupp in the mid-1980s, who was, or attempted at least, to map the theoretical boundaries by means of Thyssen polygons, which I won't go into today, of Iron Age Cyprus. This is just only one map of a series of maps that Rupp was able to publish throughout the 80s. The problem is here is not a methodological one, it's also a methodological one, but the main problem here is a historical one, because if you count the different polities mapped here, the numbers vary without any explanation or without any cultural historical discussion of that problem. So again, here, the historical elusiveness, the fluctuation of these Cypriot polities becomes very important, apparent. And this problem becomes even more complicated when bringing in regional styles of terracotta figurines, etc., extra-urban sanctuaries, which I do not have the time to go into. But this just highlights the problem when trying to research territorial organizations or territorial questions, spatial questions pertaining to these Iron Age polities on Cyprus. So what can we do? I think convincingly we can follow Maria Iacobu, who already stated 10 years ago that we need to follow or develop a holistic and diachronic research approach to regional landscapes, as she has already successfully done with the Paripavas urban landscape projects and continues to do so, as well as other projects in that line, several projects initiated by Yorgos Papantonio, combining spatial analytical methods with more material-based analyses. So there's that line in which we would very much like to follow ourselves by highlighting one aspect and we're claiming one working hypothesis is that the access to and the distance from natural resources, at least in part, shaped the political economies of Cypriot Iron Age polities. And of course, the natural resource on Cyprus is copper, among many other things. So this is one natural resource which we would like to investigate, and how the availability of natural resources impacted the development of political economies, in our case, specifically that of Idalion. And so in cooperating with colleagues from the physical geography department, so again, highlighting the interdisciplinarity of all these kinds of approaches, because as a classical archaeologist, at some point, the core competencies, well, are exceeded. So we want to model the resource potential of Cyprus and relate that and correlate that with the island's polities, and by doing so, following a so-called fuzzy approach. What is a fuzzy approach? Basically, a fuzzy approach is, on the one hand, you have the map of the geological map of Cyprus, and now in this case, particularly, we're now interested in the availability of copper resources. So at first, within a raster transformation program within a GIS environment, it is possible to translate that map into a distance map to and from the copper resources throughout the entire island. But this is then, or the basis of this map is numerical, it's metrical, which does not really necessarily interest us. So what interests us is, well, how close or how far away is a specific resource from our specific site. So we are leaving the binary logic of true and false, of 0 and 1, if you want to translate that into numeric values, and enter the realm of fuzzy logic. And this is where obviously the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation as a classical archaeologist becomes very important. So by means of writing up and programming R scripts, again, which we ourselves cannot ourselves do and conduct without a huge learning effort, we can calculate certain, in this case, a fuzzy copper potential map of the entire Ireland. So where you can see areas in here in blue or correlating the numeric value of 0, the fuzzy numeric value of 0, that signifies areas where copper is less available, opposed to areas in red where copper is better available. So these fuzzy values. We did that with different other resource potentials as we define them, and this is still a work in progress. And then summed all these different fuzzy resource potential raster maps together to arrive at a summed fuzzy resource potential map of the entire island. And then again, showing us how in areas of blue, where resources are less available, and in areas in red, where resources are better available. The question is then, how do you relate that to the development of the political economies of Iron Age polities, of the Cypriot Iron Age polities? We did that again as a work in progress by using the minimum values of the accumulated resource potentials and as a fuzzy resource boundary map of the different polities, in our specific case, that of Idalion, as you can see here. What is obviously missing here in this map is, of course, the archaeology. And so we decided to go back to legacy data, which in this case, particularly here, is the Cyprus survey, which, of course, has been initiated by the BSA's own Hector Catling back in the 1950s. And luckily and thankfully, with the kind support of the Department of Antiquities in Cyprus, we were able to look into the digitized Cyprus survey records, among them, which hold digitized original sheet maps of the regional surveyors of the Cyprus survey, which marked the different regions of sites with small little comments and stuff. So it was possible within a modern GIS environment to map these original sheets and to mark the polygons, but also single points for further spatial analysis. Obviously, this is a time-consuming effort, which is still ongoing. So this is the status quo as I left the project about a year ago, and now colleagues are continuing very successfully, I hope, I think just last week, to continue on this work so that we can actually fill and correlate all these kind of fuzzy thinking with actually hard archaeological evidence. So to conclude, so spatial analyses in general and how to embed them into a more in-depth cultural historical discourse, I wanted to bring up the strengths and the weaknesses. The strengths, obviously, by landscape archaeological approaches allow to research the genesis of ancient cultural landscapes at first within a specific research area, specifically by conducting a multi and interdisciplinary approach coming from the geosciences, etc., that enriches a purely historical and archaeological research agenda. So quantitative and empirical methods may verify and or falsify purely qualitative statements. And so the multi and interdisciplinary approach allows for a broad applicability of different research questions. And importantly, I think all these approaches are independent of the specific archaeological subdisciplines. So the question of disciplinary identity comes to the fore, which is on the one hand a strength, on the other, as we've already seen, also a weakness or a challenge, because depending on the disciplinary background and the training, one has to, partially at least, overcome large learning barriers, which can be very time-consuming and entail a huge work effort, which then, as an effect, often, not always, but may lead to a too strong focus on an uncritical development and application of spatial analytical methods, so falling into a so-called methodological trap, so concentrating too strongly on the method, and therefore leading potentially to only very superficially dealing with more in-depth cultural historical archaeological questions. So therefore running the risk of treating archaeological disciplines as a natural science. Contrarily, on the other hand, weaknesses and possibly problematic premises of the different analytical methods are often not fully recognized or discussed. So one runs the risk of just following push-the-button solutions, push-the-button principles, so not really seeing what is behind that black box. So that is also something to consider. So to conclude, it is important, at least in my mind, to critically apply the different spatial analytical methods. And it's important to make its strengths, its weaknesses, and premises always transparent and always relevant to the main research questions, and to always and constantly consider that in a larger archaeological and cultural historical discussion. I think that is crucial. And to end perhaps with one last quote from James Caron: "There is no magic in spatial statistics or landscape archaeological approaches to spatial methods. They are just another widget in the archaeologist's toolkit, much like a microscope or a Munsell soil color chart. The job of interpreting the implications of all of our archaeological observations, statistical and otherwise, is and always will be the responsibility of the archaeologist." With that, thank you very much for your